What the Navy cannot deal with easily are incoming missiles, depending upon the warhead, depending upon whether or not they're hypersonic. And excuse me, they also have a great respect for the danger that submarines present. Now, I don't know to what extent the Iranian submarines, all of which are diesels and are designed for shallow water, I don't know to what extent they pose an existential threat to a carrier. Again, remember that you have submarines and you have aircraft and you have ships, all of which exist to protect carriers. I mean, the carrier itself is heavily, heavily defended. So your best shot is probably a long-range missile, the types of which the Chinese have supposedly delivered to the Iranians. And that's something called, I think, the DF-23 or DF-21. These missiles are designed specifically to attack ships because they can maneuver en route and target the moving ship. That, I think, is something they'll worry about. It doesn't mean that the diesel sub, which is very hard to detect, couldn't slip through in some sort of remarkable event. But, I wouldn't bet heavily on that.
Position. Is it true?
I would see that more as a last resort. What they can do right now is that they have weapon systems, including missiles as well as various automatic guns that are burrowed deep in the cliffs that surround the strait. And what I've heard from some of the Iranian commentators is that they can actually exert enough control where they could allow various vessels to go through that are not American vessels. In other words, they'll let vessels through they know are headed to China or Indonesia or Philippines or Japan. If an American warship or an American flagged vessel of any kind tries to go through, they can take it under effective fire. At least that's their argument. Now, if we were to destroy, let's say, most of these weapon systems, which you can do, I mean, that takes effort, takes time. But if you did that, then yes, if things are going badly, you can actually simply dump mines at the top of the Persian Gulf, and they will float naturally down into the Gulf, and they'll whirl around float down to the Straits of Hormuz, and they'll actually float around in circles in the strait. I mean, it's a nightmare. In other words, it doesn't just go all the way out to sea. You have these whirlpools, and these things tend to sit in the strait. So it's a real nightmare if they do that. But they could, as you say, if things get bad enough, if they feel they're losing, they may decide to do that. But remember, the Chinese have been stalwart supporters of the Iranians. They know the Chinese need the oil. Now, a lot of ships have gone through that strait or those straits within the last month or so in an effort to get as much oil out and over to China as possible. So I think they're prepared in China to some extent for what might happen. But I think the Iranians are sensitive to it, and that's a last resort. My personal view, having looked carefully at the Russian side, is the Russians will not intervene unless they think the regime is in danger of collapsing. At that point, they would intervene, and they would tell us before they did it. I think the Chinese are similar. And the Chinese, of course, also have enormous financial power. We're in a very fragile position right now with regard to our bond market and our looming debt and our inability to service it. The Chinese can do a lot of things to us financially they have not done. They have not dumped all of the debt that they control right now. If they dumped all the treasury bonds that they've accumulated, that's something like 700 billion. That would be catastrophic for us. So I think there are other things that the Chinese are thinking about. But the Russian side doesn't want the disintegration of Iran any more than the Turks. And I would also worry about the Turks. So if one of the things I try to tell people is people in the region are beginning to understand something. Israel wants absolute hegemony over the region. Now, the Arab states can't do a great deal about that. I mean, they just don't have the military power or the wherewithal to oppose it. But the Turks do. And the Turks are not happy about what the Israelis have been doing for the last couple of years. To put it mildly, they are enraged. You know, if you go to Istanbul, you should visit this museum, which is all about the Gaza atrocity. It's shocking, and it's very good, and it's very upsetting. And Turks move through that on a routine basis. The Turkish population would support war with Israel. So if things get very bad, the Turks might well come into this. Now, the Israelis will say, oh, no, Erdogan, he's a fence sitter, he'll never do anything. But the Turks also are beginning to figure out that after the destruction of Iran, they're probably next on the menu. All you have to do is look at the potential for a collision between the Israelis and Turks in Syria to understand that, or a collision at sea. The Israelis want absolute dominance. The Turks don't misunderstand that. They understand that very clearly. And if you think you're next on the menu, how long do you wait before you act? By the way, there's something that we might mention just here at the end, and you might ask others about this, and that is the 5 February suspension. And that suspension has to do with the START treaty, strategic arms reductions talks. The Russians have told us that they're willing to extend the treaty, and they have said they'll stay within these limits at least until we sit down and negotiate a future. We haven't really responded. And if that lapses, then there are no constraints whatsoever on the Russians in what they may or may not do with their nuclear arsenal. And given what we've seen with the Oreshnik as evidence for very high technology in the world of missiles, I shudder to think what they might do in the absence of the treaty. So I'm someone that thinks we should contact them and agree to extend it, and then also follow up at some point with negotiations, which will obviously take months, just as they did before. But I think it's in our interest to do so. Again, when you ignore this, that sends another signal to the Russians, Mario, which is not a good one. They may interpret that as malevolent, that there is actually some readiness in Washington to play a high stakes game with nuclear weapons. That's too dangerous to contemplate, in my view.